The realms below weren't flat. That's what Florian quickly found out after they left the cavern at the end of the mines and ventured into the worlds beyond. They were always going up or down, and the going usually wasn't gentle. Caves could be so expansive that one couldn't see from wall to wall, or so narrow that the Death Knights had to sidle through sideways. And, all throughout their journey, Florian had a sense that there was always someone watching them. Many someones. "How many people live here?" she asked. "Many," Boobibi answered. "Far more than the surface. You may think of it like a Xian hive, where a small area can house a surprising number of people." "Ever since the subterranean races moved under Rantel," Florian said, "one of my friends can't stop thinking about adapting the concept to surface construction." "The surface?" "Most of our buildings are under 3 stories, that's somewhere around 10 meters if one includes the rooftops. Ever since seeing how many people could be packed into a small area underground, my friend has been trying to figure out how taller buildings can be constructed. But, for the time being, every proposal ends up being so massive that it's prohibitively expensive to build." Buildings of great height were generally limited to fortifications, temples, and various vanity projects pursued by governments such as the Grand Arena in our winter. They couldn't be considered practical for the common folk, neither in cost nor utility. Lian's answer always seemed to be to cut down on building materials, but that ended up with structures looking like they could be toppled by a stiff gust of wind. Alternatively, they could use enchanted materials, but that made things many times more expensive than they originally were. "Is there a need for more people?" Boobibi asked. "Tribes grow because they need to compete with their neighbors. The Sorcerer King is so strong that I can't imagine any number of humans making a difference in a contest that requires that strength." "Military might is merely one facet of society," Florian answered. "The total military personnel of the human countries that I know of number no more than 2 or 3% of its total population in times of conventional war. Only 1% of the Baharuth Empire's total population remains as a standing army in times of peace, and Riestais has not even a tenth of that. That does not sound like nearly enough to defend one's territory against one's competitors. It's what they've managed with. Things are, of course, more complicated than they appear, but those countries don't treat their entire population as war potential like the tribes of the Abelian wilderness do. That non-combatant population is what we refer to as the civilian population, and civilians have many vocations in various fields to pursue for the prosperity of their country." "To me," Boobibi said, "it sounds like human countries make for opportune targets. The defenses are weak and the rewards for attacking them are great. Though, as unbelievable as it sounds, what you say does appear to be the truth. Even before the coming of Yaldabaoth, the Holy Kingdom was an easy target for hungry tribes in the west." "Even with the Great Wall?" Florian asked. The Xian hero made a derisive noise. "Fortifications are only as effective as the people who defend them. In the case of the Holy Kingdom's wall, raiders often found that no one was defending it. People looking for a fight had to wait around for a patrol to finally come by or assault positions that were consistently manned. The more I see and hear of Roble," Falagram mumbled to the side, "the more pathetic it seems. Yaldabaoth's invasion is framed as some horrible thing, but countries like that completely deserve what's coming to them." Florian narrowed her eyes at his callous assertion. "Are you suggesting that all of the innocents who suffered at Yaldabaoth's hands somehow deserved to be subjected to all the horrors of his occupation and its aftermath?" "It's not a suggestion," the dwarf lord replied. "That's how the world works. Most humanoids are weak, in the grand scheme of things. Survival's the name of the game, and peace is just time used to prepare for the next war. A country where everyone isn't focused on supporting the continued existence of their civilization is a country filled with parasites. No one will miss them when everyone dies, and everything that they wasted their time on will end up in the hands of their enemies." "If I recall correctly," Florian said, "Clan Fielhammer just started a war with its own people." "As I said," Falagram replied, "survival's the name of the game. That includes surviving against one's own kind. Velgarth's account pins blame solidly on the council, anyway." Assuming Velgarth's account was the truth, Florian couldn't disagree. Khazanar's presiding council had every opportunity to inform Clan Fielhammer about their activities if it was in response to an external threat. Because they didn't, Clan Fielhammer would logically interpret their treatment and the information that they managed to gather as evidence of a plot against them. She shook her head sadly as she considered the apparent sequence of events. A great many tragedies throughout human history and countless lesser misfortunes could have been averted through proper communication, but it only seemed that humans never learned. It also seemed that the problem wasn't limited to humans. "What do you plan on doing when you get home?" Florine asked. "Secure it," Falagram answered. "It doesn't matter whether it means kicking the council out or fighting off possible invaders from elsewhere." Falagram's lease presented an interesting scenario that hadn't yet happened with the Sorceress Kingdom's other clients. The terms did not take into account internal disputes or disputed claims across different polities. By and large, the royal court saw the countries that they dealt with as whole entities. From their perspective, they annexed Irantal from the kingdom from Riestais. However, the truth was that they pressed a claim against House Vaself. House Vaself raised a levy through its territories and its vassals, and that levy was the royal army of Riestais. In the end, while it was commonly said that Riestais lost Irantal to the Sorceress Kingdom, the reality was that House Vaself lost a duchy while its vassals retained their holdings. Thus, the power of House Vaself was greatly diminished relative to the rest of the kingdom of Riestais. Similarly, while the Baharuth Empire might have supported the Sorcerer King's claim, Florine was certain that the Empire had no say in it. The Emperor had simply made an arbitrary statement as an autocrat, ignoring any protests from his people. Thus, he stood to reap all of the benefits of his move, which he in turn doled out through the imperial bureaucracy to solidify his hold on power. The Sorceress Kingdom had then gone on to save the Dwarves, the Holy Kingdom, and the Draconic Kingdom. The Azalisian mountain dwarves had been reduced to a single city, so it probably wasn't incorrect to consider them as a single political entity. Queen Auricula's had the support of her entire country. The Holy Kingdom, however, was by all appearances divisive, and the top-down view of the Sorceress Kingdom's royal court seemed to have in no small part contributed to its current woes. What the Sorcerer King saved was the Northern Holy Kingdom, and the Sorceress Kingdom's relationship with Roblé was with that of its royal court. No, it didn't even go that far. Their relationship was with the country, which they treated as a monolith under Roblé's royal court. The aid that it sent to the Holy Kingdom was literally to the Holy Kingdom, and the shipments were received at the border where they fell into the hands of whoever was waiting for it. The fact that kingdoms and empires were made up of hundreds, if not thousands of smaller polities that had rights and laws of their own didn't seem to factor at all into the Sorceress Kingdom's political, economic, and military thinking. This was probably because they were so ridiculously powerful that there were no tangible consequences for simply doing what was convenient for them. By the same token, they would probably hold an entire nation accountable for the actions of a single minor noble if it suited their purposes. Falagram's lease was just the latest manifestation of that behavior. Clan Fielhammer was a single principality amongst a dozen or so in what was collectively known as Khazanah. Falagram Fielhammer just so happened to be the Sorceress Kingdom's proverbial foot in the door, so they wasted no time in accommodating his request. Not that his stated purpose violated any terms. As he said, he was securing his holdings, and that was exactly what the undead security leases were supposed to be for. This, in itself, wasn't the problem, however. The problem was in how flexible the Sorceress Kingdom could be when it came to using undead leases to pursue its agendas. Falagram's suspicions about the lease contracts trying to split the world in half started to take on a more defined and disconcerting meaning. Falagram's lease amounted to procuring mercenaries for a domestic dispute. This could, in theory, happen anywhere. A baron in Riestais who believed that his fief was being unlawfully seized could have Death Series servitors delivered to them at a very reasonable rate. For defensive purposes, of course. Never mind that. If one wanted to declare their independence, all they had to do was sign a contract that was not only far cheaper than the taxes that they paid to their liege, but also far superior in terms of realm security. If Emperor Jerkniv hadn't swiftly moved to seize the initiative with the Sorceress Kingdom, the Baharuth Empire might be in 100 little pieces by now, considering how many enemies he had among his vassals. The potential for chaos was seemingly infinite. Florian could imagine Leanne strolling up to a highly factious country offering defensive security contracts and cackling to herself as it shattered overnight. All that really mattered was whether the Sorceress Kingdom wanted things a certain way or not. Given the royal court's ongoing practice of dealing with foreign countries as single, large entities, they probably wouldn't encourage it, but it could still serve as a tool to reshape the geopolitical landscape as they saw fit. Never mind thinking about what Leanne would do. My thinking is drifting into that sort of thing, too. All of the dark dwarven negativity was starting to infect her outlook. Leanne, at least, was generally upbeat about her scheming and aimed for what she saw as beneficial ends. The dark dwarves, on the other hand, were just plain nasty with a bleak worldview. It felt as if they would have liked nothing more than to set the entire world aflame just so they could rule over the ashes. One of Falagrim's rangers appeared from behind a huge stalagmite in their path. Shrieker Grove, she said. 2 kilometers ahead. Falagrim's expression immediately soured. Son of A, is there a clear path through? Yeah, the ranger smirked, it's paved with enchanted adamantite, too. The dwarf lord clicked his tongue and turned to examine the head of the undead column. How large is the grove? He asked. The area with shriekers covers 5 kilometers, the ranger answered. Caverns about 500 meters wide. Set them off and see what happens, Falagrim told her. The ranger nodded and left again. What's a shrieker? Florine asked. They're annoying is what they are, Falagrim answered. A shrieker is a species of mushroom, Boobibi told her. If one is disturbed, it starts screaming. That screaming disturbs others and then they start screaming too. Does the screaming do anything? Humanoids are perhaps least threatened by them, Boobibi replied. In the realms below, many species have tremor sense or blind sense. The sound is so intense that it can blind beings that rely on vibrations and sound to discern their surroundings. So it's a way for the mushrooms to defend themselves, Florine nodded. At least there was at least one thing that wasn't trying to murder everything around it in the realms below. Yes, but that is not all. Some creatures use shriekers to notify them of others entering a specific location. So they run away when predators come around? Or come running if they are a predator, Boobibi added. Florine cringed as an ear-piercing shriek echoed up the cave. The noise turned deafening as more and more voices joined the chorus. Aren't we still far away? It took a few minutes for silence to settle over them once again. She removed her hands from her ears. I didn't expect. Shh. Florine shut her mouth, warily looking around. Not that it helped much. One might think that dark vision items negated the disadvantages that humans suffered in low to no light conditions, but the range on Florine's was so limited that anything attacking her would be on top of her before she had time to react. It didn't take long to notice that the dark dwarf rangers nearby weren't only watching the way ahead. Their tension only served to emphasize how dangerous their environment was. Death could come from every direction, even directly through the stone. Once the rangers gave the all-clear, Falagrim motioned for the column to advance. 10 minutes later, they arrived at the cavern with the Shrieker Grove. The source of the noise from before turned out to be the glowing amber mushrooms within that stood around her height. Ah, that's what it was, Velgarth nodded to herself. That's what was? Florine asked. You reminded me of something, Velgarth answered, but I couldn't figure out what it was until now. Tall, yellow, and noisy, you'd fit right in here. The ranger from before came down from her perch on the wall of the cavern near the entrance. There's a goblin tribe living around here, she said. A big one, a few thousand, I reckon. They came streaming out of the walls when the screaming started, looking for prey. How much time do we have? Falagrim asked. Should be plenty, the ranger answered. They don't look very wary at all. What would they be wary of? Florine asked. Falagrim and the ranger exchanged a long look. The dwarf lord jerked his beard toward Florine before turning away to address the gathering column. There are predators, the ranger said, and there are predators. Goblins are the former. The really powerful predators don't sit on top of a single grove of shriekers, they sit in the middle of a whole bunch of them. That sound those mushrooms make can carry for dozens of kilometers. The goblins here know how long it takes for the local super predator to get over here, so, when they make themselves scarce, we'll know that something's close. Moving out, Falagrim said. Double time. I don't want to be around when a dragon lord from the lower realms comes up to see who's making the gods' awful racket. Are dragon lords so common that one can just pop up randomly anywhere down here? Florine asked. I thought the 8 Greed Kings ended the Age of Dragons. The 8 Greed Kings? Falagrim frowned. Ah, you mean those guys. They didn't have much of an impact down here. But our legends say that they conquered the entire world, Florine said. They were overlanders. The entire world to you overlanders is the surface. Maybe they poked around here and there, but I doubt they explored every cubic kilometer of the realms below or the oceans. As for conquered, how much of their legacy have you seen? We certainly haven't seen any of it down here. That was. Her lips moved without sound for a few moments before she stopped trying to talk with a puzzled look. Then, she realized that there was no sound coming from anything. It appeared that they had cast silence spells to cover the living so the sound from the surrounding mushrooms wouldn't deafen them as they walked through the grove. Florian let out a silent sigh, pondering Fulagrim's point. While she couldn't claim that the histories available to the Irantal region were anywhere close to complete, the lack of evidence made anyone familiar with the legend of the 8 Greed Kings ponder just how much of it was true. They were supposedly so powerful that they could move mountains and part the seas, but no one could point out where this had happened to verify the claim. That they stood as tall as the heavens was simply ludicrous. Their conquest of the world happened in the blink of an eye, but that was undoubtedly hyperbole. Most damning of all was that claim of conquest, as it implied that they had extended their dominion over the entire world. Yet, there was no sign of that conquest, no infrastructure, institutions or cultures that suggested the existence of a world-spanning empire. The only verifiable proof of their existence was in a city in a desert over 15,000 kilometers southeast along the western coast of the continent, and, even then, people merely asserted that it was somehow linked to them. In the end, all that was left were the histories of various peoples passed down mostly through oral tradition. The only unifying theme was that they were destroyers. Rather than conquerors who built a worldwide empire, it was more likely that they were glorified raiders, sowing chaos and destruction in their wake with no care for the consequences. Boobibi poked her in the arm. It was more like a touch, but her chitinous, pointy appendages made a touch feel more like a poke. Florine looked down at the Xian hero, and then her gaze followed Boobibi's gesture out to the forest of glowing mushrooms. The illumination from the shriekers was comparable to a drawing room lit with candles. Now that she could see a fair distance, she started to notice things that she hadn't before. In a word, the surroundings were filled with life. The shriekers weren't the only mushrooms in the grove. A bed of moss and smaller fungi carpeted the cavern floor and crawled with teeming things. Small clusters of waist-height mushrooms served as homes for larger creatures, though most of those were insects, worms and mollusks. The tiny streams that trickled through the cavern were home to colonies of shellfish and amphibians. Every pond that they walked around had schools of tiny fish. Above the shriekers, there were mushrooms so tall that they could only be compared to trees, their caps creating a canopy that nearly touched the cavern ceiling 20 meters above them. Every now and then, a dark silhouette would flit across the backdrop of phosphorescent light as some bird, bat, or giant insect flew by. There was an otherworldly beauty to it all, but the small figures she spotted moving between the distant stalks were a constant reminder of how dangerous it could be. Hundreds of goblins shadowed their procession from the sides, armed with simple spears and bows. A part of her itched to see what they were made out of since there were no trees around and mushroom stalks couldn't be used the same way. As they crossed the widest portion of the cavern, she was met with another familiar sight. They have Nook down here? A sizable herd was grazing along the opposite shore of the cavern's central lake. Furthermore, it looked like the goblins were herding them. The ranch was on a stretch cleared of amber mushrooms, allowing them to pursue their pastoral industry in relative silence. In hindsight, it wasn't the first time she had seen subterranean Nook. The Azalesian mountain dwarves had been ranching them for as long as anyone could remember, and the Quagga learned animal husbandry from captured dwarven slaves at some point. Now, they were trying to raise them under Irantal. Florine opened her mouth to ask whether the dark dwarves raised Nook as well, but the silence spell was still in effect. She settled on absorbing the scenery as they marched through the cavern, attentive for any other signs of industry or even commerce. Unfortunately, the goblins showed no signs of employing fire, which ruled out a vast swathe of possibilities. Their pace picked up as they approached the opposite end of the cavern. It was only then that Florine realized that their goblin escort had vanished. The tireless undead soon passed the dwarves and Fulagrim turned and made an impatient gesture with his arm, beckoning for the stragglers to break into a sprint. Then, something hit her in the stomach. What? Her gaze went to her feet where a goblin arrow lay. She stopped to kneel and pick it up, but then Boobibi grabbed her arm and dragged her off, arrows landing all about their feet. At some point, the Xian hero picked her up and ran off at full speed, passing several dark dwarves along the way. They didn't stop until they were well into the narrow passage leading out of the cavern. Heavy breathing filled the air as the silence effect was dispelled. "The sound's getting closer," Law said. "Don't stop," Falagrim said. "Pick up anyone that's too tired to keep going." Florine couldn't hear anything. She tried looking behind them as Boobibi continued to carry her overhead, but the light of the grove was long gone. Then, a furious voice echoed through the darkness, so high-pitched that even a young girl would be hard-pressed to imitate it. "Insolent fools! You dare defile a Vigerie's domain with the undead?" "Shit," Law said in a low voice. "I was hoping it wasn't her." "Damn Shrieker Grove gave us away," Falagrim spat. A set of dwarven shouts echoed up the passage behind them. Then, nothing. No one dared stop to see if they were still being followed. Falagrim's rangers led them as they struggled to maintain their pace, taking a winding route to evade any possible pursuit. Death Knights scooped up the dwarves that flopped to the ground in exhaustion along the way. "What was that?" Florine asked when they finally stopped. "Something you don't ever want to mess with," Law told her. "A monster?" "A legend," Boobibi said. "No, it would be more accurate to call her a god." "A god?" "To the races that delve deep enough under the Abelian hills," Boobibi explained. "A Vigerie is known as the mistress of the Dark Grove. She is the protector of the upper realms in this region. The goblins switched from shadowing us to attacking us when they knew she was close." "Treacherous little buggers," Falagrim muttered. "Remind me to go out and slaughter 100,000 of them when we're done with the council." She couldn't understand how he could justify that. The goblins he would target would definitely not be the ones that lived under a Vigerie's protection. And, since she was described as a protector, did that mean the goblins siding with her believed that they were doing what was right? It seemed that the undead were reviled even in the lands of endless night. "So what is a Vigerie again?" she asked, "race-wise, I mean." "She is a fairy," Boobibi said. "And an extremely powerful druid. A Vigerie has dwelt under the Abelian hills for centuries, perhaps since the beginning of time. Heteromorphs are immortal, after all, and her kind is closely intertwined with nature." "A fairy? Now I want to see." "So she attacked the undead rather than us specifically, right?" Florine asked. Leaning against the other wall of the passage, Velgarth scoffed. "I can't believe this," she said. "Don't tell me you want to go and talk to that bitch?" "Not right now," Florine said, "but I'll probably need to in the future. From what everyone has been saying, she's actually a good person that the locals side with." "Protector doesn't mean good," Law told her. "You may as well consider her a force of nature. Anyway, between that grove and the angry fairy, I'm pretty sure I know exactly where we are now." Falagrim pushed himself back to his feet. "Great," he said. "How many kilometers to go?" "See for yourself." Law waited for everyone to get up before leading the way again. As the minutes passed, a dull roar started to reverberate through the air. The sound grew in intensity until it felt like the stone floor was vibrating with the sound. Whatever it was, it filled the steps of Falagrim and his people with renewed energy. When the roar felt like it was physically shaking her, they stepped out into another cavern. At least Florine thought it was a cavern, as all she could see was endless darkness. A light spray filled the air as she followed the procession, slicking the stones upon which they tread. Then, all at once, she was confronted by a colossal wall of water. A waterfall? She wasn't sure whether it could be called that because the water was falling up. Falagrim turned around, casting his gaze over his followers. "This is it," he said. "We're home." For the first time in her memory, Falagrim smiled. Florine could immediately tell that it wasn't a good thing. "But why is it falling up? Is there some rule that says that it needs to fall down?" Florine frowned as she stared up at the wall of water. According to Velgarth, in addition to being over 2,000 meters tall, the falls were roughly 500 meters wide. Boobibi had mentioned a great falls in her accounts of the realms below, but Florine imagined something more normal. The waterfall, or maybe it was a waterfly, was so high that she could neither see the top, nor the bottom of it. Or is it the bottom and the top? A single undeniable example of something that defied her past reality also threw language and thought into chaos. Was it alright to use the old terminology? Would anyone believe her back in Erantle if she'd told them about it? "You don't have to goggle so hard at the thing," Velgarth said. It's been there since before our people settled Khazanah. Where did your people migrate from? Florine asked. Below, Velgarth answered. Some empire in the Middle Realms. You aren't connected to them anymore? Not that I know of, the dwarf woman shrugged. We were a colony that got too big, too far from home. Splitting off was inevitable, but there were probably a bunch of assholes, anyway. Boobibi's claim of Khazanah Falls being an access point to the Middle Realms appeared to be true. There was no record of dark dwarves dwelling on the surface or having a subterranean presence elsewhere in the region. That Khazanah was the only place in the world with dark dwarves was implausible, and the fact that they came from below explained how they ended up there. She couldn't decide whether them cutting their ties to their homeland was a good or bad thing. On one hand, it could have been a source of priceless information about a world previously unknown to the surface. On the other, dealing with one small group of dark dwarves was bad enough. Do you interact with the Middle Realms in any way? In a manner of speaking, Velgarth said. Everyone in Khazanah's sphere of influence is a target. A target? For raiding. The surface is a source of exotic slaves, but it isn't our only source of slaves. Is forging ties with the Dark Dwarves really a good idea? She had no choice but to follow through with her assignment, but it was already abundantly clear that the Dark Dwarves had nothing but enemies in the region. They couldn't even leave their own borders without tripping over them. If it were up to her, Florine would have worked on establishing friendly relations with the various goblin tribes they had passed on their journey instead. That felt far more beneficial in the long run. How did your people end up with a slave economy, anyway? Florine asked. Industry and high-quality craftsmanship are what the world attributes to dwarves in general, and dwarves appear to take pride in their work. Raising slaves is a craft, too, Velgarth said. Just because you don't do it doesn't mean that it isn't. Besides, slave economies are the world standard precisely because it's the best way to do things. You don't think something else would have outcompeted it if it wasn't demonstrably superior? Florine held in a sigh as she watched a large fish fly by. She hoped it would survive the fall, or whatever. Slavery was a morally reprehensible institution, but the Dark Dwarves obviously didn't care about her moral standards. From a factual, economic standpoint, she had no hard statistics to disprove the assertion that slavery was superior to systems that didn't incorporate slavery. The Sorceress Kingdom was a non-example since Lord Mayor's magic was the primary driver of the country's outstanding agricultural fields. Undead labor in itself did not improve yields, only how the work was done. What would you say are the primary merits of the system of slavery that you practice? Florine asked. First, Velgarth answered, counting off her fingers, it incentivizes raiding. You have to keep your neighbors weak anyway, so why not profit from it? Secondly, slaves aren't cursed with independence. They do what they're told to do or they get fed to the other slaves. Lastly, slaves free up us dwarves for more important occupations. Why have a dwarf herd knock or sweep dung off of the streets if they can be an artisan, grey robe, cleric or soldier instead? The powerful stay in power by being powerful, not by toiling away at menial tasks. She remained silent at what was likely the penultimate crystallization of the world's cruel realities. As of yet, it was probably the most frustrating thing that she had no answer for. Raised as a noble, Florine understood that a ruler needed to maintain a balance of strength, stability, and prosperity. Strength was required to defend one's holdings from invasion and enforce laws when people challenged them. Without strength, the efforts of an entire civilization could be stolen away by threats both external and internal. The problem was that the reality that Florine was raised in was one which was far from the truth. In realist eyes, one person was not too different from any other in terms of strength. An average member of a town or city militia could easily be overwhelmed by two farmers. The difference between the products of a journeyman artisan and a master was imperceptible to those without an eye for their craft. Leaders relied more on the careful cultivation of an economic and political power base over years, decades, and even multiple generations than they did on raw personal ability. Thus, her world had been a mundane one. Normal people could be nothing more than normal, and so that led to the thinking that everyone was more or less equal. Geniuses, talents, and heroes were an anomaly in everyday life. It wouldn't be wrong to say that most people placed them in the same category as monsters. Monsters that were on the people's side, but monsters nonetheless. With the advent of the Sorceress Kingdom came a rude and undeniable awakening that upended common perception and laughed in the face of their society's core values. For people like Clara and Ludmilla, who followed the faith of the Six, all that was required was a minor adjustment to their expectations. Simply put, they raised the bar on everything, but all of their practices and beliefs still held true. If anything, it only seemed like those beliefs were reinforced. For Florine and Leanne, who followed the faith of the Four, it was an unprecedented crisis on all levels. Fundamental values were overturned and even their morality was cast into question. Every theological, societal, and even economic assertion was proven erroneous in some way because the world itself was not as it appeared to be. Her stance on the institution of slavery was the most recent thing to come under attack, and, while she could still decry the immorality of slavery, she could not prove that it was incorrect. If anything, logic clearly pointed to the idea that a slave economy, as Velgarth stated, was the best economic system. The problem lay with how damnably deterministic the world appeared to be. Levels dictated what people could accomplish, what information they had access to, and what they could digest. They even influenced thought and perception. This suggested that free will and economic mobility were detrimental to level-based growth. If one took the classic rags to riches story that inspired spares to seek their fortunes in the big city, the problems became readily apparent. A second son would be kept on the farm until their family was assured that the eldest son was fit to take over the tenancy. This often went for as long as it took for the heir to have an heir of their own. In that time, the second son would be helping out around the farm to earn their keep and thus gain a few levels in farmer job class levels. After that, they would then end up in the local town or city and take whatever work they could get to survive, picking up the levels associated with that work. The harvest rush meant that they might even gain more farmer job class levels when they took up seasonal work. By the time they got into their chosen profession, they would have a diverse portfolio of job classes. The more ambitious one was, the worse it became. Magic was a bad one in particular, as it was an expensive vocation to get started in, forcing people to work more to afford magical studies and thus end up with more junk levels in their build. It was no small wonder that good magic casters were so rare. According to Lord Mayor, the average level that an adventurer hit their limit at was around 15 and no more than 20. If the same limitations applied to everyone, then it explained why the realities of the level system had eluded the people in the region for so long. Guilds recognized master artisans of mundane professions at around level 3 or 4, or rather, the quality that an artisan of that level would produce qualified as masterwork. The spare in the aforementioned example could have 2 levels in farmer, 1 in rogue, 2 in fisherman, and 1 in merchant and still have plenty of room to spare to become a master tailor. This was the truth behind the classic success story and, even so, not many obtained their desired success. On the other hand, if one took the tragic tale of a child who had been sold into slavery by their family or abducted by the local criminals or authorities, or both working in cahoots with one another if things were particularly terrible, the story that their level bill told would make their misfortune seem like anything but. In a country where slavery was a common and accepted practice, the child would be purchased with a specific purpose in mind. For instance, a short-staffed textile manufactory would acquire the child and then they would work as a weaver for the rest of their lives. They had no say in the matter, no freedom to choose. The child was set on a path pushed onto them by a factory manager. Yet, when one compared the spare from the farm and the slave since childhood, there would be absolutely no comparison. The spare with 2 levels in farmer, 1 in rogue, 2 in fisherman, 1 in merchant, and 4 in tailor would be vastly inferior to the slave with 10 in tailor. The slave outstripped the free-willed spare not only in a cold, economic sense, but also in terms of their raw skill and overall capability as an artisan. All else being equal, when one scaled things up to compare a country that enforced the rights and freedoms of its citizens to one with a functional system of institutionalized slavery, the former would be buried by the latter's raw industrial might. The entire system of slavery was kept intact because those in charge occupied positions of power that couldn't be challenged by their slaves. It was a depressing conclusion to arrive at. Of more immediate concern was that the freewheeling manner in which Riestize's societal norms treated the concept of career progression would eventually no longer be acceptable to the royal court of the Sorceress Kingdom. No matter how compelling the struggles of the Level 4 tailor were in a narrative sense, Lady Albedo would not be satisfied with the Level 4 tailor. She wanted a level 15 tailor and she wanted every tailor to be at least level 15. Nothing but the best for the Sorceress Kingdom. Maybe that's one of the reasons why she sent me along with the Dark Dwarves. Since Velgarth described the process of raising slaves as a craft, then it stood to reason that they had a formalized system of training. Florine couldn't imagine that it would be something only slaves could do, so understanding what that system did and how it worked would serve as a practical example for the Sorceress Kingdom's future public education system. It was potentially a solid first step to making their citizens just as competitive, if not better, than highly specialized slaves. I guess what they say about diplomats being spies is correct. It didn't feel wrong, though. Or maybe she was just subconsciously trying to justify her actions. What are you kids fooling around here for? Falagrim's gruff tone startled Florine out of her thoughts. His frown turned severe when she spun around to face him. This isn't the time for a swim, he said. Florine looked down. Her dress was thoroughly soaked by the spray from the falls and a small puddle had formed around her feet. She wiped her face, taking a few steps away from the ledge. Have your rangers returned? They just left, Falagrim said. I didn't know you were in such a hurry to get killing. But I thought that these falls marked the eastern border of Karsanar. Do you think that our entire country is stuffed in some tiny hole in the ground? She didn't think it was a tiny hole in the ground, but she did think it would be something like the Dwarf Kingdom in the Azalizia Mountains. Then again, their realm had been fairly large before the coming of the demon gods. In that case, Florine asked, how will we get to your principality if we have to walk through the other parts of Karsanar? You should know by now that the realms below don't work like the surface, Falagrim answered. We just have to take a route that doesn't bring us through the other principalities. Right. Florine was aware of the vast differences between the underground and the surface, but it was still difficult for her to not think as an overlander. Getting somewhere in the realms below was a three-dimensional exercise. One could arrive from any direction so long as a passage existed. A half-day later, the first of Falagrim's rangers returned from their foray in the Karsanar. Falagrim and his Kada gathered as she made her report. The border posts are undermanned, she said. We didn't run into any patrols at all. Those damn fools, Falagrim sneered. What's the point in trying to uproot one's enemies if it leaves the borders open to invasion? Any sign of external threats? None from this side, the ranger replied, then smirked. Except for us. Laura and the others went ahead. Once everyone's ready to go, I'll lead you over to the first waypoint. You heard her, Falagrim looked to the others. Break's over. We leave in 10 minutes. They left Karsanar Falls through the tunnel by which they had entered, taking a different passage several hundred meters in that led them deeper into the earth. Their journey went completely uncontested, even when they supposedly came within 200 meters of the nearest border post. 6 hours from their departure, they arrived at a small cavern where another ranger awaited them. Way's clear to mine 884, boss, he said. Still no military presence. Run into any vagabonds along the way? Falagrim asked. Yeah. They got no clue that anything's going on. We killed them off, just in case. Good, Falagrim nodded. The ranger turned without another word and swiftly led them on their way. Their path grew steep and Florine couldn't help but feel more and more oppressed as kilometers of stone were added to the looming weight above her. The sight of all the bodies that the rangers left in their wake didn't help to improve things. Didn't you say that the falls are fed by Lake Karsanar? Florine asked. Yeah, Velgarth answered. What about it? We've been going down for a while now, Florine said. I figured we'd have reached the water by now. The entire reason why the lake and the principalities exist is that there's a formation of impermeable rock in the region that pokes out above the main layer, Velgarth told her. You can think of it as an island or mountain sticking above the water. We're well below the lake's surface already. But the middle realms are below the lake. Aha. A chill crept over her. The middle realms were supposed to be far more dangerous. The stone of the passage abruptly became straight as they entered a network of mining tunnels. They arrived at a nexus of rail lines where the next ranger leaned against the control lever of an old, rusted switch. The design of the rail system and its old mine carts weren't too different from those used by the Azalesian mountain dwarves, though Florine supposed there wasn't much room for wild variation. Clear? Falagrim asked. Sort of, the ranger answered. We bypassed the ports since Velgarth said they were occupied by the council, but they don't seem to be guarding all of the old mining access tunnels. Still, the Feelhammer mines have their people wandering around, so it'll be a fight the moment we pop up. How are they set up? Still facing forward, the ranger replied, not looking over their shoulders at all. So they're still trying to conquer Feelhammer, but they're confident that the ground they've covered is secure. Any signs of a trap? Laura and the others will have a better idea. They're up as far as they can get, checking for just that. Falagram grunted and turned to face the gathering undead. Fall in. The Death Series servitors and Elder Liches came forward while the dominated undead formed ranks behind them. Time to talk tactics, Falagram said. Well, it won't be all that complicated for now. Take a look all around you. What you'll be fighting in looks just like this. Each mining tunnel is no more than 2 meters tall and 2 meters wide. You'll have to crouch a bit, but there'll be no worries about being outmaneuvered, circumvented, or overwhelmed. Every fight will be right in your face. One of the Elder Lich sergeants raised a bony hand. Should we expect any significant threats? Not right away, Falagram replied. According to Velgarth's report, they're using the standard order of battle, which means they've lost the mines already, they just haven't realized it. Their defense will have 4 layers. The first will be cheap battle thralls that they use to assess and wear down enemy strength. Next, will come the veteran battle thralls that usually clean things up. When they fail, you'll be facing the real army consisting of an infantry line and an artillery line, but they won't be challenging us down in the mines for obvious reasons. How should the new zombies be deployed? We'll use them to saturate the mines. Hiding will do the enemy no good when the tunnels are so narrow and there are so many zombies that one is bound to trip over them. I'll leave the management of newly acquired combat assets to you. Oh, and if you happen to find any dwarves, capture them for questioning. What of our ethereal assets? Velgarth here's an unincarnate, Falagram gestured to his daughter. We'll put them under her command. The undead dispersed to reorganize themselves, occasionally conferring with Falagram or one of his subordinates. Unlike any of the Sorceress Kingdom's other clients, the Dark Dwarves didn't display even a sliver of fear before the undead. There was only unfeeling expectation. For the undead's part, they seemed almost excited at receiving their assignments. Florine watched in silence in an out-of-the-way spot along the walls. On the far side of the cargo hub, she spotted Velgarth with several Elder Liches and a glowing wall of wraiths. What's the thing that he called her? Florine said. An unincarnate. A psionic job class, Isaraka said. Now that we have a name for her vocation, we can positively identify what happened at the point of her first appearance. And what was that? The memory of Velgarth emerging from the poor dark dwarf's body still haunted her memories. It wasn't the gory entrance that was the most harrowing part about it, but the indescribable expression of the dark dwarf just before Velgarth burst forth. An ability called Uncarnate Bridge, the Elder Lich told her. The Uncarnate can transfer themselves into the minds of other creatures, hopping from mind to mind until they reach their desired destination. The remanifestation of their corporeal form can be explosive for the host. So is that something charges can be pressed for? I believe you are far better equipped to answer that question. There are no related precedents to refer to. International justice was not a concept that was recognized by the countries of the region. The closest thing that came to it was the organizational enforcement of the guilds or the temples, and the temples essentially operated as a guild in that case. While no one wanted undesirable elements within their borders, neither were they obliged to extradite said persons to those after them. As such, those interested in seeking restitution for crimes committed against them rarely went to foreign authorities to demand it, they simply hired assassins to settle the score. In the case of the Sorceress Kingdom, their undeserved international reputation made it so that fugitives didn't try to flee there anyway. They had a strange sort of reverse extradition treaty with the Baharuth Empire, but it wasn't as if the Sorceress Kingdom wished to become a haven for criminals. It didn't even have to involve criminals. Slaves who fled across the border would be promptly returned to their masters even if slavery was illegal in the Sorceress Kingdom. Falagrim's band wasn't a group of fugitives to be extradited, regardless. They were more of a wandering penal colony under the management of Khazanar's judiciary. At the same time, they were a merchant company and merchants were more than welcome in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. What a stupid case to think about. Florine had a feeling that the Sorceress Kingdom would render a favorable interpretation of the related laws just to keep things rolling along smoothly with the Dark Dwarves. There was simply too much to lose over a dead dwarf who was already sentenced to a fate worse than death. "Death is a mercy," Florine murmured. "Or so they say." "Indeed," Isoroku nodded. That aside, Florine switched topics to perk herself up. "How is your survey work coming along?" "I lack the resources to perform the task satisfactorily." She reached up and patted the Elder Lich over the shoulder. "We didn't expect there to be so much down here," she consoled the Elder Lich. "Did you find anything interesting?" "There appears to be great agricultural potential underground," Isoroku said. "If the region under the Abelian Hills could be brought under the Sorceress Kingdom, it would represent a substantial boost to our industrial output." "Would it be considered a part of the Abelian wilderness?" "That would be subject to the discretion of the royal court. Due to the drastically different environment, it stands to reason that it would be considered its own area, or perhaps divided into many areas." "I see," Florine said. "Well, don't go converting everything you see into economic gains just yet. We barely have any idea about how things work down here." While her time in the Abelian wilderness thus far had been short, the complex interactions that had been revealed to her now made her wary of interfering in anything before she felt that she had a decent grasp of what was going on. There was something far greater to what she once considered straightforward processes, and hints of it could be found all over the Abelian Hills. The world was filled with mysteries, but the society in which she had been raised seemed to actively enforce mundanity at every turn. There was no room for anything but practicality and profit. Something was either useful, or it was useless. If it had power that couldn't be harnessed, then it was an uncontrollable threat. Mystical unknowns and esoteric practices may as well have been treated as blasphemy against common sense and rationality. And, so, the world was ordered according to that worldview. Products, people, places, even entire species. In doing so, Florine felt that they were losing out on something important, something intrinsic to the world that they lived in that they had long lost. It wasn't as if there wasn't evidence to point out the possibility. One of the more well-known examples was the fact that alchemical reagents harvested in the wild were measurably more effective than those cultivated in city gardens and personal plots. But no one seemed to question why that was. They only saw the process of harvesting those reagents as inefficient and expensive. Furthermore, the availability of foraged reagents was insufficient to meet commercial and industrial demand for alchemical products. Thus, it was treated as trivia for enthusiasts and not much else. The Abelian Hills, however, was filled with many new mystical processes to investigate. Sites that humans from the north would undoubtedly exploit were instead held universally sacred. Seemingly dangerous and destructive events were allowed to run their course. Human development couldn't encroach upon the land because the region's tribes were so powerful and belligerent. Now that the area had fallen under the dominion of the Sorcerer King, a priceless opportunity to find out what they were missing had presented itself. Florine resolved to make sure that she wouldn't screw it up. On that note, she told Isoroku, "We need to start bringing in some experts to make sense of everything." "Did Lady Albedo not select for your expertise?" the Elder Lich asked. "In certain fields, yes," Florine answered. "We've turned up enough stuff that it would be prudent to have teams learned in other fields to make a study of what we've discovered. This would be the jurisdiction of the Adventurer Guild and its affiliates." "Does that Adventurer Guild have a jurisdiction?" It was sort of like a jurisdiction. Due to the nature of the Adventurer Guild's work and the fact that they currently only had enough members for a single expedition, however, the other branches of the government were far outpacing them. "Does that make me something like an adventurer?" "That would be kind of neat. What rank would I be?" A series of echoing clanks drew their attention to the center of the cargo hub. "Seems like we're all sorted out," Fulagrim's voice filled the chamber. "It's time for death to have its due. We're moving out. I want us in the city by the end of the day."